The private jet's engines hummed to a stop as the stairs were lowered onto the cold gray tarmac of JFK Airport. Mick Wills sat in his plush leather seat for a moment, staring out of the window at the breathtaking skyline of New York City. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and purple, a winter sunset casting its golden glow over the towering skyscrapers. The city he called home. The city he had built his empire in. He let out a deep sigh and ran a hand through his neatly styled dark brown hair. His watch, a custom-made Rolex, gleamed under the cabin lights. He had everything a man could dream of: wealth, influence, and the kind of power that made people listen when he spoke. But as he sat there, surrounded by luxury, there was an unmistakable hollowness in his chest. The flight from London had been long, but exhaustion wasn't what weighed on him. It was the feeling he had been carrying for years now, a sense of loneliness, a quiet emptiness that no amount of success could fill. A soft chime from his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Mark, assistant. Your fiancée, Victoria, is waiting at Terminal 3. She's wearing a red coat. Mick exhaled slowly and forced a smile. Victoria. Beautiful, poised, and the perfect match for a man of his status. Their relationship made sense. She came from old money, a family with generations of wealth and connections. Their engagement was more of a business arrangement than a love story, a carefully curated partnership that would merge two powerful families into an even greater force. And yet something inside him resisted the idea of seeing her again. He should be excited. After all, wasn't she everything a man like him was supposed to want? Shaking off the unease, Mick straightened his crisp navy suit and stepped out into the cold evening air. A gust of wind hit him, sharp and bracing, but it did little to shake the heaviness in his heart. The moment he entered the terminal, the buzz of city life surrounded him. Travelers hurried past, dragging suitcases, embracing loved ones, and rushing to their next destinations. It was chaotic, yet strangely comforting, the kind of energy only New York could provide. He walked with purpose, his polished leather shoes tapping against the glossy floor. His heart drummed in his chest, not from nerves but from an unfamiliar restlessness. And then he saw her, a woman in a red coat, standing near the baggage claim. Victoria, or so he thought. Mick didn't hesitate. He strode toward her, his body moving on instinct. The red coat was unmistakable. He reached her, his arms opening wide, and without thinking, he pulled her into a firm, familiar embrace. She smelled like vanilla and jasmine, software, warm, and completely unfamiliar. For a split second, everything stopped. Something was wrong. Mick pulled back just enough to look at her face. Big, deep brown eyes stared up at him, wide with shock. A stranger. His stomach dropped. I'm sorry, but do I know you? She asked, her voice gentle yet firm. Mick felt the color drain from his face. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had hugged the wrong woman. For a moment, Mick couldn't breathe. The realization hit him like a shock wave. He had just wrapped his arms around a complete stranger. The woman in front of him looked up, her deep brown eyes wide with surprise. Her soft, full lips parted slightly, as if she, too, was struggling to process what had just happened. The scent of vanilla and jasmine still lingered between them, a delicate fragrance that felt strangely familiar, even though he had never met her before. Mick took a step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He let out an awkward chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. I thought you were someone else. I'm so sorry. The woman blinked, then tilted her head slightly, studying him. Instead of looking annoyed or offended, her lips curled into a slow, amused smile. Well, she said, crossing her arms, that's one way to greet a stranger. Her voice was smooth, like honey with a hint of playfulness. Mick felt the tension in his chest loosen slightly. There was something about her, something easy, something real. He had spent years in boardrooms, shaking hands with politicians and billionaires, attending charity galas with socialites who spoke in carefully measured words. Every conversation in his world felt calculated, as if everyone was constantly performing. But this woman, she was different. Mick found himself smiling despite his embarrassment. I'm Mick, he said, extending his hand. The woman glanced down at his hand, then took it. Her fingers were warm, her grip confident. Jasmine, she said simply. Jasmine. The name suited her. It was soft yet strong, like the way she held herself, completely unfazed by the millionaire who had just made a fool of himself. Before Mick could say anything else, the moment was shattered by the sharp, unmistakable click of high heels against the marble floor. There you are, Mick! Mick turned just in time to see Victoria approaching, her perfectly curled blonde hair bouncing with each furious step. She was wearing a designer coat, the deep red fabric hugging her slim figure, her expensive handbag clutched tightly in one hand. But it wasn't her elegance that caught his attention. It was the look in her eyes, anger and jealousy. Mick barely had time to react before Victoria stopped beside him, her manicured nails digging into his arm as she pulled him closer. Her icy blue eyes flickered between him and Jasmine. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice clipped and sharp. Mick opened his mouth to explain, but before he could, Jasmine took a step back, her expression unreadable. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice calm and polite. "No worries." And just like that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Mick felt an unexpected tug in his chest, a strange sense of loss as he watched her go. He didn't even know her, but something told him that in another world, in another time, this moment might have meant something more. "Let's go," Victoria snapped, her grip on his arm tightening. But Mick barely heard her. His mind was still on Jasmine. The city stretched endlessly before Mick as he stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. New York was alive, glowing billboards, rushing taxis, the endless hum of a city that never truly slept. But inside his luxurious home, everything felt unbearably silent. He had returned hours ago, yet the air still crackled with the remnants of his argument with Victoria. He could still hear her voice, sharp and filled with resentment. "You embarrassed me, Mick!" And over what? Some random woman? Her words had stung, but not for the reasons she thought. Mick wasn't ashamed of what had happened at the airport. He wasn't even thinking about the public embarrassment. What unsettled him was the truth beneath it all, the way his heart had skipped a beat when Jasmine had smiled, the way his mind kept replaying the warmth of her touch, and the way Victoria's anger didn't hurt. It only made him feel free. Mick exhaled, running a hand through his hair, his gaze drifting to the city below. He and Victoria had been together for years, but not in the way people imagine. Their relationship was polished, poised, and carefully curated for the world to see. She was the kind of woman his circle expected him to be with, wealthy, powerful, the daughter of an influential family. Their engagement was a business deal wrapped in diamonds and expensive champagne. But was it ever love? Mick turned away from the window and sank into the leather couch. His mind replayed the evening's confrontation. Victoria had paced the penthouse, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I mean, honestly, Mick, you hugged a complete stranger, in front of everyone." "It was an accident," Mick had said, trying to keep his voice even. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't entirely true. Sure, it had been a mistake, but why had it lingered in his mind? Why had he felt something so real in a single moment with Jasmine? Something he had never felt with Victoria in all their years together? Victoria had scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You were smiling, Mick. When was the last time you smiled like that around me?" That single question had frozen him. Victoria had seen it too. The flicker of something real, something missing between them. And then, in a moment that should have devastated him, Victoria's anger faded into something else. Something worse. Indifference. "Maybe this isn't working," she had said, her voice quieter now. Maybe it never really did. Mick had expected to feel panic, regret, or even sadness. But instead, an odd sense of relief washed over him. For years, they had been pretending to be the perfect couple, pretending that their relationship was more than just convenience. But tonight, they had finally stopped lying. So when Victoria had finally packed a bag and walked out of the penthouse, leaving behind only the echo of her last words, Mick hadn't stopped her. He had simply stood there, staring at the door long after it had closed. And now, as he sat alone, He didn't feel the crushing weight of loss. He felt something new, a sense of possibility. Because as much as his life had been built on strategy and careful decisions, there was one thing he had never planned for. Jasmine. Her eyes, her laughter, the way she had effortlessly stepped into his life and shaken something inside him. He had known her for less than an hour, but she had left a mark that Victoria never had, and that thought terrified him. But it also thrilled him. Mick exhaled deeply, his fingers tightening into fists. He didn't know what it was about Jasmine that had drawn him in. Maybe it was her warmth, her easy confidence, or the way she had simply walked away, unaware of the effect she had left on him. But he knew one thing for certain. He had to find her. Mick Wills was not a man who accepted defeat. His entire life had been built on persistence, on chasing what he wanted until he got it. That mindset had turned him from a young entrepreneur with nothing into a self-made millionaire. It had made him one of the most respected names in the tech industry. But this, searching for a woman whose last name he didn't even know, was unlike any challenge he had ever faced. Jasmine. That name had been stuck in his mind since the moment she walked away. He had replayed their brief encounter over and over, questioning why a single hug, an accident, had shaken him so much. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the truth remained the same. It had felt real, and real was something he hadn't felt in a long time. A search without a map. Mick started where it all began, the airport. He returned the next day hoping to catch even a glimpse of her. He checked the baggage claim area, walked past every cafe, scanned every face in the crowd. But Jasmine was nowhere to be found. Undeterred, he expanded his search. New York City was massive, a maze of people, businesses, and endless possibilities. Finding one woman without so much as a last name was like searching for a single star in a galaxy. But Mick refused to give up. He spent his evenings walking through busy streets, slipping into coffee shops and bookstores, wondering if she might be sitting by a window, sipping tea, lost in a book. He even found himself at a small art gallery downtown, mesmerized by the paintings, wondering if maybe, just maybe, Jasmine was the kind of woman who appreciated art. Days passed, then a week, then two. Most people would have given up. Mick didn't. He had everything: money, connections, the ability to call in favors from some of the most powerful people in the city. But none of that could help him find Jasmine. This wasn't about business or strategy. This was about fate. And fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor. A familiar figure in the park. It was a cold evening when Mick finally found her. He had been walking through Central Park, his thoughts consumed by the search, when his eyes landed on a familiar figure sitting on a bench. His breath caught. Jasmine. She was bundled up in a soft gray coat, her hair tucked behind her ears as she sketched in a small notebook. The glow of a nearby street lamp cast a warm light over her, making her look almost unreal, like something out of a dream. Mick's heart pounded in his chest. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed what he might say if he ever found her again. But now that she was right in front of him, all the words disappeared. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. Jasmine? She looked up, her deep brown eyes widening in surprise. Mick? The sound of his name on her lips sent a strange warmth through him. She stared at him for a long moment before shaking her head with a small, incredulous laugh. What are you doing here? Mick hesitated, then sat down beside her. I've been looking for you, he admitted, a little breathless. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Why? Mick met her gaze, his lips curling into a small smile. Because, he said slowly, I think I hugged the right woman after all. Jasmine let out a soft, incredulous laugh, shaking her head as she closed her sketchbook. You don't even know me, Mick, she said, her voice carrying a mix of amusement and caution. Mick didn't hesitate. He met her gaze with an intensity that surprised even himself. Then let me. She studied him, her deep brown eyes searching for something. Doubt, insincerity, maybe even arrogance. But all she found was quiet determination. Finally, she sighed, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. All right, Mr. Millionaire. Let's see if you can handle the real world. Mick grinned. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but for the first time in his life, he was excited about the unknown. Over the next few weeks, Mick and Jasmine's lives became intertwined in ways neither of them had expected. Mick was used to a world of luxury, private jets, exclusive restaurants, and people who only spoke in business deals and social contracts. But Jasmine? She lived in a different world entirely. She worked two jobs, one as a waitress at a small cafe in Brooklyn and another as a freelance artist, painting whenever she had the chance. Her apartment was tiny, with walls covered in her artwork, a place filled with color and warmth despite its size. She found joy in simple things, listening to street musicians on the subway, sketching strangers in coffee shops, laughing with neighborhood kids who admired her paintings. Mick had spent his life chasing power and wealth, believing they were the only things that mattered. But with Jasmine, he felt something he had never felt before. Peace. She showed him how to slow down, how to appreciate the beauty in moments that couldn't be bought or controlled. They wandered through Central Park, sipping cheap coffee instead of expensive wine. She took him to a tiny hole-in-the-wall diner that served the best pancakes he'd ever tasted. They sat on her fire escape at night, talking about dreams instead of stock markets. Mick had never laughed so much, never felt so alive, but not everyone saw their love the way they did. The world's judgment. One night, as they walked hand in hand through the city, Jasmine's expression darkened. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Mick, we come from two different worlds." He stopped, turning to her. "So what?" She sighed, looking away. "So everything." Her voice was heavy with something deeper than just doubt. It was experience. Mick had grown up in privilege, always welcomed into the most elite circles. But Jasmine, she had grown up fighting to be seen, to be heard. She was the daughter of an immigrant mother and a father who had struggled to provide. She had faced racism in classrooms, in job interviews, in the way people looked at her when she walked into a high-end store. "People like you don't end up with people like me," she said, her voice laced with sadness. Mick felt his chest tighten. He had never truly considered how deep the world's prejudices ran. He had never experienced being judged for his background, never been told he didn't belong. But Jasmine had. He reached for her hands, holding them firmly. "Then let's prove them wrong." She stared at him, her eyes filled with emotions she couldn't voice. Hope, fear, love. Mick didn't care about the rules society had tried to write for them. He only knew one thing. He wasn't letting go. Mick Wills had spent his entire life believing in control. He had built his empire through strategy, through careful planning, through understanding how the world worked and mastering it. But love. Love was never part of the plan. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of Brooklyn, holding the hand of a woman who had rewritten everything he thought he knew. Jasmine had changed him, not in a way that made him lose himself, but in a way that made him finally feel like he had found himself. He no longer cared about what society expected of him. He didn't care about whispered gossip in wealthy circles, the raised eyebrows at charity events, or the subtle but undeniable disapproval of people who believed love should follow a set of unwritten rules. All he cared about was how Jasmine made him feel. Alive. For the first time, he wasn't living for appearances. He wasn't chasing success to fill the emptiness inside him. He had found something real, something that didn't need validation from anyone else. And he wanted to show her just how much she meant to him. Back to where it all began. One crisp evening, Mick told Jasmine he had a surprise for her. She laughed, shaking her head as they got into his car. "You know I don't need fancy surprises, right?" Mick smiled but didn't say anything. He just drove. When they arrived, Jasmine gasped. JFK Airport, the place where their story had begun, the place where fate had stepped in, twisting what should have been a mistake into something neither of them could walk away from. Jasmine turned to him, her expression filled with curiosity. "Why here?" Mick took a deep breath. "Because this is where I realized everything I thought I knew about love was wrong." She looked at him, waiting. "I used to think love was about finding someone who fit into my world," he admitted. "Someone who checked all the right boxes, someone who made sense on paper. Jasmine's lips parted slightly, her breath hitching. But then I met you, and you didn't fit my world. He took her hands in his. You made me want to build a new one. Her eyes welled up with tears. Mick. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Are you sure about this? She whispered. Mick's voice was steady. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. And then right there, right in the middle of the busy terminal, he pulled her into another hug. The right hug. The hug that had changed his life. Proving the world wrong, a year later they stood side by side, proving every doubt, every judgment, every whispered criticism wrong. Their love wasn't about where they came from. It wasn't about race, wealth, or what society expected. It was about where they were willing to go together. Because real love wasn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It was about breaking the mold completely. This story teaches us that true love is not about wealth, race, or social status. It's about connection, understanding, and the willingness to grow together. Mick and Jasmine came from different worlds, yet they found something deeper than what society expected of them. Their love wasn't built on appearances or convenience, but on genuine respect and emotion. Real love defies stereotypes. It challenges societal norms and proves that the only barriers between people are the ones we allow to